Hi, listener. This is From Ideology to Unity. So, I had a thought about the feminist concept of objectification. And I sort of new age, non-dualistic perspective on it. I've already done a video about this, but I had something else I wanted to share on that. So, objectification. The idea is, what feminists are saying, is that when a man looks at a woman paying attention to the physical characteristics exclusively and the lust they feel, the attraction they feel towards that, without paying any attention to the character of the fact that they were dealing with a person, when they act on that, effectively, let's say trying to shut up a woman in order to have casual sex, or for example, right? That is, or even just like looking and enjoying the view, right? That is selfishly, effectively using the woman and treating them like an object and not a person, and that's dehumanizing essentially. And they've kind of got a point. So what is my new age answer to that issue? So a lot of feminists tend to be, I'm generalizing, but they tend to be quite angry about this. And there's a sense of that the way men are being conditioned in society by patriarchy makes them treat women in a horrible way and act nasty in that way, and that they're just treating them like, that men these days treat women like, well, like they're not even people, just for their own selfish desires, and how terrible that is. And there is an understanding historically about how women have been treated, and a sense of, almost a sense of righteous fury and indignation, but also a sense of victimhood and a demand that it stop, an insistence and a demand that two men that it stop, right? And that it's happening all over the place, and that's terrible. And they will point out examples, and they will do that to quite a degree. And they feel passionately about that. Okay. And I understand this in terms of the wounded masculine, and perhaps even the wounded feminine. In our fallen egoic state that we've been in the last 12,000 years, obviously the egoic desires play much more of a role. And actually, we're coming to a point where Eckhart Tolle says that the ego gets more unstable right before it dies, essentially. And at this point in time in history, things are getting more chaotic, partly because of how the ego is actually on its last legs, so to speak. And these, but also if you consider the dynamics of that self-centered lust towards the opposite sex, which is, you see form, and the ego is obsessed with form generally. The man sees form, the hormones race, the mind races, and then there's an excited feeling, and you see the form, and there's thoughts come to mind about, might come to mind, especially in the wounded masculine, in the mind of the wounded masculine, all sorts of thoughts will come to mind about different positions that one can have, right, take and so forth, especially when hardcore pornography has been accessible to young people, has been accessible to men in millennial generation and Generation Z, like from a very young age. I mean, before that, there were magazines about it. And they also, if you consider, like, historically, even though there's been traditionalism and the guilt mongering regarding sexuality of traditionalism, there has simultaneously been prostitution for that much time as well. So the whole time there's been this sort of contradictory madness regarding sexuality, where there's been a lot of lust and indulgence in that by the women masculine, but at the same time, a lot of guilt associated with that from religion and traditionality, religion, right? So as I was saying, there's all these thoughts and intense feeling of, I guess, a desire for pleasure and a desire for, and thoughts about what we could do, right? That's what the wounded masculine, especially with just the hormones that a man gets anyway, and an underdeveloped lack of presence, an underdeveloped, if a man is, if they're if within their relationship with their sexuality is underdeveloped, their sense of how they get love and how it manifests will be through sex and those sort of desires, rather than a higher bonding that's about a connection between two people on a personality level. Now, when in the fallen state of ego predominating, and whether it's the wounded masculine, it was inevitable that there was going to be basically a lot of what you could call objectification, a lot of that self-centered sexual desire in men towards women. Now, that's not in any way justifying it. And in fact, the point that feminists make about how it's treating women as objects and not people is actually valid, in the sense that, well, that is literally what it's doing. It's completely selfish, and it does actually. And when you dehumanize people, you're not really treating them well. You're not going to be inclined to treat them well. And of course, historically, women haven't been treated very well. And in fact, when feminists say that patriarchy affects men too, they are right insofar as the way things have been for a long time, and all the gender roles have actually, men have been dying in wars over it, and men have had to be like expected to be macho or whatever, and if they're not meeting the expectations, they're not real men, right? That is true. So what I'm doing here is I'm not saying, well, I'm recognizing the point that feminists are making. I'm honoring their perspective. And at the same time, we can move beyond duality and limitation and not just stick to that. Because at the same time, it's worth considering that it's not men's fault that it has been this way, given that we've been in ego for the last 12,000 years and that the masculine has been wounded. That is exactly what you'd expect. Now, the fact that there's this awareness that it's a problem and a desire for that to change in feminism, and the fact that feminism is even a thing could well be a reflection of the fact that we're becoming somewhat more present, and that there's more awareness, or at the very least more awareness in the collective consciousness or unconsciousness or both of humanity, and in the feminine energies as well, that there's a higher level of consciousness and awareness of what's wrong. And there's a general principle in spirituality, of a New Age spirituality, where it's not that things are getting worse, but rather our awareness of how, to oversimplify, our awareness of how bad it is has increased. For example, authoritarianism. Like, there was a long time people took for granted that there was domination, control, and you obey the kings and the lords or whatever. This domination control was just like taken for granted as the way it works, right? But then there's this high, heavy focus on democracy and civil liberties and so forth. And this is a really relatively new thing. There are examples where it happened before, like in Athens, but if you consider, like, the Athenians had slaves and treated women appallingly. So yeah, they were democratic, but what does that really mean in that sense? So the point is that this higher awareness of how to treat people in society, whether we're treating women better or just people treating people better, that's a reflection of the times we're living, where there is a higher awareness as we're prior to and during the awakening process, right? We are at a point in awakening. We're in the age of Aquarius, but towards the end of an age, you'll get a little bit of what you'll get in the next age, right? So that it's a transition. It doesn't all happen at once. That's why there's been a raising awareness of how bad it has been, and that includes how women have been treated, and the mentality of looking at the other sex in terms of what you can get from them relating to your desires. So this is attractive, this is desirable, I could get this, I could get that, I could get that from them. Now, the ego is all about that. And so regardless of sexuality, the wounded masculine, what it does is it's a wounded masculine and it's egoic. That combination in men will mean that it will be all about how to get, well, wanting is fundamentally egoic, but there's also a sense of lack in there. There's a lack of love, a lack of self-love, and a lack of feeling loved, and a sense of, well, I will feel loved if I can have sex, essentially, right? But the desires never end. In fact, there's ever more sexual desires and ever more that could play out, ever more positions, ever more and so forth, right? Ever more positions and so forth. Egoic desires never really end. That wanting, it doesn't really lead anywhere except for more wanting. And it's fundamentally based on a sense of incompleteness. So there's something fundamentally sad and tragic about this, what you could call objectification, or this sexual lust, the selfish lust of the wounded masculine. There's almost a self-hatred and a sadness, and yeah, the sadness to that, because it's from the sense of, you're not complete as you are, you're not good enough as you are, you need sex to get that. But except that when you get it, you still don't feel complete, because there's more and more and more you can get. And it's a reflection of the ego and wounded masculine, as I've been saying, what, like, I don't know how many times in this episode. Now, I don't know if you're sure, but I have this feeling of the wounded masculine seeks to gain control or maintain control in a superior position so that it doesn't feel like a victim and feel powerless and weak and just and unloved and so forth, because it feels incomplete. But the wounded feminine, I would say, seeks to complete itself by and be safe by being controlled. There's a sense of, now essentially, especially if you get with this whole the bad guy appeal, that a bit of rough sort of appeal that you get in the wounded masculine, is a, or perhaps even the femme fatale thing, is that there's this, there's a heavy emphasis on seducing a man and feeling loved by having male attention, and especially if it's the wounded masculine's attention. That if someone wants to have sex with you or does have sex with you, then you're loved, then you're complete, then you'll be worth something in society because you're desired. And that sense of, there's a lack of self-love, and the sense that you will feel love, the love that you're fundamentally lacking towards yourself or lacking when you're growing up. Because fundamentally, the wounded masculine and the wounded feminine, there's a lack of love from parenting early on, right, essentially. And for most people, essentially, for a long time, for 12,000 years or something. And a sense of incompleteness and ego and so forth fundamentally involves that sense of incompleteness, the sense of not good enough as you are, you need something to be good enough. And yet there's always more needed to be good enough. And so the wounded feminine seeks to be desired, to be, for some reason what popped in my head was be penetrated, but I mean, I didn't, I don't know why that could, well, okay, to be the object of desire, whereas the wounded masculine seeks to be the subject that desires and gets what it desires. The wounded feminine seeks to be the object of desire, and that being desired is how they get their sense of love and completeness, or at least temporarily. And there's also, as I mentioned in the previous video about feminism, there's a drama triangle where, aside from the rescuer, what you get is there's the victim, and then there's the perpetrator, or is it the aggressor? Well, it's the same thing. Essentially, one feels safe by being in control, the other feels safe by having the responsibility of control being done by someone else, and being safe by following the dictates of those that control you. And that is why, now, there are some people who they look at, for example, the tendency where some women will complain about objectification and being treated like a sexual object, and then wear low-cut dresses and show off their bodies to attract it. And they will say that's contradictory and hypocritical. And to which feminists will say, well, you should treat me with respect. I'm just expressing myself and my sexuality. It's not about what you want. Now, they both actually have a point, in the sense that what those who look at that contradiction see is that they're acting in a way to bring about what they're complaining about. But the reason this happened, the wounded feminine does this, is because that's how they feel safe and complete and loved in an egoic, wounded way. And what you're getting is, it's almost codependent, that relationship of controlling and selfishly getting what you want from someone to get pleasure and a sense of feeling loved and complete by fulfilling a want and desire in an egoic way, and then being the object of desire, and that being desired being a way of feeling that you're worthy, that you're good enough, that you're loved. But it's always temporary. And this fundamentally, it is a toxic dynamic, as feminists point out, but the reason it's happening is fundamentally due to the state of lack of presence and of ego and of woundedness that we've been in for the last 12,000 years. And without that context, the understanding of that spiritual context, there is simply just an anger about it and a judgment about it without empathy. And it's understandable, especially given that the means and the techniques for being present and not being in ego are not something that the largely secular feminist movement has at its disposal, or accept, or is inclined to, have within their belief structure. And as a result, their response, they may have a higher awareness to, they realize there's a problem with how women have been treated, and even are mentally, the objectification relationship. They're aware of that, but what they haven't got the degree of presence and ego necessarily to not be angry and judgmental of men and feeling like a victim about it. And that's why there's this rage and judgment and accusation leveled at men about that. But what does the wounded masculine do when the egoic wounded masculine, someone in that kind of state, what will they do if they already do kind of feel guilty on a subconscious level? I mean, men who went to prostitutes who were traditional at the same time were always guilty about what they were doing, even though on some level, even though they were still doing it. So that sense of guilt can be painful to feel, and especially if it's suppressed or repressed, what happens is you're accused of something like that, or you're told off or whatever, and you're receiving another anger, and you feel attacked, you feel judged, and well, you feel like they're causing you that pain, even though it's actually something within you already and it's just being triggered. It's just coming to the surface with the catalyst that they are giving. Without that awareness, that many men don't have that awareness, because ego and the wounded masculine, because of that, they will often react negatively. Now, of course, when there's guilt, there's two ways people can deal with guilt. Either it's repressed. Well, there's more than two ways, but it could be repressed. That's one option. It's repressed generally if it's not accepted, it's too painful to deal with. Another option is accepting it, but not letting go of it, but rather clinging onto it and beating yourself up over it again and again and again, in a more sort of self-flagellating way. And that's what typically the male feminist will do, or the feminist ally, which is even more self-flagellating, says, I'm not even worthy enough to be a feminist, I must be an ally. So it's just the ultimate, well, it shows a lack of self-esteem, but then that's something to sympathize with, not something to denigrate if someone is in that position. And then that's a response that the wounded feminine might just, that the wounded masculine, if it's criticized for how it acts and its tendencies, might just take a victim, it might take a role which is actually, yeah, I'm a piece of shit. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I am a piece of shit. Then identify with being a piece of shit, because the ego can do that. The ego's looking for an identity. And if that's what the socially acceptable idea is, that you're a piece of shit man, there are lots of men who are in ego who will incline to accept that kind of identity. I mean, the alternative is be actually processing it in a healthy way, in a way that, in a mindful way. But many people aren't aware of that option. So they generally just deny it and be like, no, nothing wrong with me. You're being a nasty bitch, fuck you. And then they might even take an ideological stance against feminism, which they see as a threat to them and the cause of their them feeling hurt, which isn't true. They already feel hurt because of their incompleteness, their sense of incompleteness, which is illusionary, and them being an ego and the wounded masculine. They're already hurt. It's like a wound, right? And that wound is being poked when they're accused of that, because they already, and that then it hurts more, but they're not identifying the fact they've got a wound. They're only seeing the fact it's being touched and it hurts. So, however, if you look at when a feminist accuses a man like that, the wounded masculine, of that, and gets that response, what they don't see is that this is someone who's wounded. This is the wounded masculine, and it's like, and they're reacting that way because they're wounded. It's like if someone has a broken arm, right? And if you poke that broken arm, and you're saying you shouldn't be like that. You shouldn't be this way. If someone's walking around on, I don't know, they've got bandages on or whatever. And if you think about it, the way the wounded masculine acts towards women is kind of like almost like bandaging over it's a coping mechanism in a sense. So it's like, yeah, saying you shouldn't be this way. You should be better. You should, and it's kind of like, well, they're not. That's what they're like, but that's the state they're in. The state they're in is that the masculine energies in them are wounded, and their best way of relating to their sexuality and getting a sense of love, and to women in general, their best way at that point in time is trying to get laid, right? That is literally the best they've got. Otherwise, they would be acting better. The way people act reflects their state of mind, their frequency, right? If someone's frequency is in control or lust and wanting pleasure to feel temporarily complete and temporarily loved, if hookup culture or whatever, if that is how they're acting, that's the state they're in. And if that's the state someone's in, well, they're suffering. I don't blame or judge feminists for not appreciating that. I'm generalizing, not necessarily, but I don't judge them for that. But I understand that, given everything the wounded feminine has come to, that given all historically in many past lifetimes there's been rapes. Hell, honestly, the souls of people who are men in ego with the wounded masculine, there've been women who are being raped before in past lives. And it's manifesting as the wounded masculine, now they're in a male body, potentially. So it's really messed up what's happened to humanity. And yeah, and there's a sense of, well, I'm now aware of how fucked up we're being treated as women, right? I'm now aware of there's all this basically objectification, or treating us like we're just blow up dolls to get off on, and not actually appreciating our humanity. No one likes to be dehumanized, right? There's a sense of that. And they're just like, that's fucked up. You're fucked up. Fuck you, you pieces of shit. And I can understand that there's that rage and indignation and judgment and so forth. And I can understand the response to that in the wounded masculine of fuck you. There's nothing wrong with me. You're being a bitch, blah, blah, blah. Fucking feminists, all of that. And it's like, then you get this dualistic fight over ideological fight and arguments and all that stuff about like the whole issue. And nothing's getting solved. People are having their inner pain like triggered or whatever. Cause a catalyst for each other. And in order for some sort of progress away from that situation, there has to be a higher degree of not just awareness, but a high degree of mindfulness, a high degree of presence. And that is something that from practices in the New Age community and in Buddhism, and increasingly in psychology, mainline psychology these days, because it's starting to appreciate these approaches in presence, mindfulness, and so forth, meditation, these sort of things, and help us move past an ideological battle that's ultimately not making us any happier. But of course, we've got to recognize that this ideological battle itself is a reflection of the state that these people are in, and the fact that these are egos on their last legs. And so the egoic patterns are intensifying, and all this pent-up negative energy and trauma and woundedness is all coming to the surface and playing out, and all this built-up karma is all playing out, right? And so, of course, it's highly chaotic. It wouldn't be any other way in an awakening. This is exactly what would happen. And in this context, I see that some people in the New Age movement are still have very much a feminist perspective. Some have an anti-feminist perspective. Some people don't have either, or have other perspectives. And I suppose what I see is a way forward beyond the dualistic ideological arguments and struggles, and it comes from a recognition of the fact that we're largely playing out dramas externally that are reflecting our state of woundedness and feeling incomplete and ego. I know I've kind of repeated myself in this, but honestly, I was going on the moment, right? Trying to piece it together. So hopefully that's been interesting and helpful. It just feels important to me to really grapple with these issues, because, it's easy to just avoid that. We could just be, okay, we need to be spiritual mindful. Politics is negative, and we see all the arguments that people are having, and we're going to feel like, let's just stay away from that and meditate, right? I get that perspective, but I feel like, and at the same time as well, like there are people who aren't ready for mindfulness and spirituality. They're not ready to stop arguing with each other. And maybe there's a reason why they're doing that and dealing with that catalyst and negativity still. They need to process it still. And maybe that's what they're doing on some level. But if I can just voice my truth on this issue, perhaps it will be helpful for some. And honestly, I'm getting to a point where I feel like expressing your truth, whatever your truth is, in the moment is itself a fantastic thing. It really, I feel like it really serves just to be dwelling in authenticity and speaking one's own truth, communicating it, because communication has an effect, even if no one hears it in the straightforward physical sense. And I encourage you, even if it's just in the privacy of your own home, to, you know, speaking out, thinking out loud or something, just speak your truth. Even if it's just in your head, you know, on some level, speak your truth. And it doesn't need to be, oh, I'm trying to change everyone's minds and trying to get an outcome where people agree with me and see the way it is. Like, that isn't helpful. What we need to do is just simply, you've got your truth, you're communicating it, that's enough. Now, I'm fortunate to be in a position to do that on a podcast, where potentially more people can listen. But fundamentally, I suppose I'd want to do that even if I wasn't doing a podcast at this point. Now, yeah, that went on longer than I expected, but really getting it across in the particular way I had in mind took more time than I expected, and that's fine. So yeah, if you listen to all of this, thank you. I appreciate your patience, and bye for now.